My name is Annie Jones. I was born a rich man's son. My parents named me Tommy Richards after my grandfather who had built our family's multi-billion-dollar company from the ground up. I had a life of privilege that was most would kill for. Like the other children I grew up around, I was left a substantial trust fund by my parents just as their parents had done for them. By the time I came into my family's money, we no longer owned my grandfather's company. My father sold it at the behest of my mother. She was a domineering figure who had my father completely under her thumb. She was a tall, thin woman who stood nearly 6 foot tall in the 3-inch heels she favored wearing. She had slight waves in her long blonde hair that complemented her thin face nicely. My father never dared to disobey or differ from her. I knew well that he believed her to be some sort of goddess that he was lucky to have in his life. Growing up, I knew that the dominant figure in the family wore a skirt. That was what I had seen growing up and believed to be the natural order of things, even as terms like dominatrix and submissive were all alien to me. I never realized that anything was unusual about my parents until I did with my future in-laws. I was courting the strong-willed daughter of another family of multimillionaires. Their family could not have been any more different from mine. Mrs. Jones was subjugated. Whenever her husband spoke, she listened and nodded dutifully. She expressed some opinions that differed from her husband's, but when he pressed her she fell into line behind her husband. I had never known that a woman could be that meek. I knew why my Sophia had so many problems with her parents at that moment. She was so different from her mother, and her father probably expected the same level of deference from his daughter as he did from his wife. Deference was not something that Sophia embraced. Sophia idolized my mother even as my mother had little use for her. Mother rightly saw Sophia as a threat to her dominion over me. She could tell right away that Sophia had the same sort of control over me as she had over my father. Sophia, on the other hand, saw my mother as the archetype of what a woman should be. Despite the disapproval of my parents and Sophia's, we married. Neither of our parents was angry enough to cut us off. In fact, it was quite the contrary. My mother and Sophia's father competed with each in making gifts to us. Each used their financial might to spoil us so that we would favor them over the other. That lasted until my parents died. My mother went first from a stroke. My father never got over losing her. He moped around for a year looking utterly helpless until he too expired. After father's will was read, my wealth exceeded Sophia's. Not that it mattered in any practical sense. We were married, and we merged our fortunes like so many of our childhood friends did. However, we weren't like our friends. We had a little secret that caused us to uproot ourselves from the community we had been born into and sever our ties with our longtime friends. My secret was not an uncommon one for males of my disposition. It was simply this. Since I was a young man, I've dressed as a woman. I don't know when the desire first rose up inside me, but I can't remember living without it. I grew up jealous of the clothing that my female neighbors and classmates got to wear. They were fortunate enough to get to wear such pretty colorful dresses and blissful feeling tights, while I was forced to walk around in drab dress pants and socks. Part of me wanted to be those girls, but that was not my greatest fantasy. I longed to be a woman, but not just any woman. I wanted to be a domestic like the kind that raised me while my mother was off enjoying her wealth. I grew up surrounded by them and idolized them. When my mother would catch me staring at them as a teen, she would scold me to keep my hands off them. She never knew the real reason behind my attraction, even as she browbeat my father into submission in front of me. For as much of a dom as she was, she never discussed or, as far as I know, realized that I was a crossdresser. I often wonder if she really knew, but I'll never get that answer now. My mother's maids never brought it up with me either. They knew I was different from my parents. I actually talked with them rather than simply order them about and scold them. Some of the younger ones were upset by this, but I think they felt they could not tell me to leave them alone. I understood that they were in no position to, and I used that to my advantage to learn about how they worked and lived. I knew the younger girls thought I was trying to seduce them, but I sometimes felt the older ones knew better. I believe they knew I wanted to get in their panties, but I didn't want to have relations with them. Sophia quickly picked up on my cross-dressing when we started dating. We grew up in the same neighborhood and went to the same private schools after primary school. She knew my family and knew I was as submissive as my father. I was raised to defer to women, and I did. Sophia was raised to defer to men, but she just found that idea ridiculous. I think observing me and my family made her realize just how wrong her parents had it. The two of us embraced gender roles that were quite out of the norm. She was the dominant force in our relationship while I was her sub. We played little games before we married where I would pretend she was my mistress and I was her slave. It was an early taste of the life we would have together after we married. We bought a home together not long after we wed. It was then that she fully embraced my cross-dressing. She bought me a French maid's outfit the day we moved in. Since we did not have a domestic at that time, I knew what she wanted. I did not object and saw it as a good way to save a little money when we were just living on our trust funds. I spent most of my time en femme after that. I of course broke character to play the man I was supposed to be at our family gatherings and when we had our friends over, but I was primarily the maid in our household and that was the way we both liked it. After my father died, we had a massive fortune on our hands after taxes. I was the sole heir of the money my parents had not already provided for me in trust. It was then that Sophia decided that we should start a new life together where we could live the roles we played at home openly. By that time, our arrangement was settled. Sophia was Miss Richards, my wealthy empress, and I was her lowly maid Annie. Those were the little details that my wife was ready to turn from a game into our permanent identities. Part of me knew that I should resist totally surrendering my life of privilege and cursed masculinity, but I never had the backbone to refuse Miss Richards anything. Like my father, I felt that my statuesque bride was a goddess whom I was lucky to have. Miss Richards purchased our new home on the other side of the country in an affluent area where domestics would not seem out of place. When we moved in, the household was furnished and ready for us. Miss Richards had decorated the entire home without any input from me. I was not at all upset by this since I knew that my opinion on such matters was of no importance to Miss Richards. The day we moved in, Miss Richards took up residence in the master bedroom, while I was sent down to the servants' quarters that was located in the basement of the mansion. I knew in my heart that separate bedrooms were for the best, but still I knew I would pine for Miss Richards' presence next to me. The house was large and required the services of other servants to maintain. It had 6 bedrooms, excluding the servants' rooms. There were 7 full baths and the ceilings of the living room and dining room were vaulted. There was an Olympic-sized swimming pool in the backyard surrounded by well-maintained gardens. The house contained intricate wood carvings in the molding around the ceilings, floors, and doors. There were luxuries everywhere in the home for Miss Richards to enjoy. The luxurious and ornate surroundings that Miss Richards enjoyed in that home could not have been more different from mine. The maid's quarters was comprised of 2 bedrooms, a shared bathroom, kitchen, and living area. While I had it to myself for the time, I knew that others would be joining me in the close quarters. The floors of the bathroom and kitchen that I was able to call my own were linoleum while my mistress's were made of Italian marble. I smelt the dank couch that rested in the living area of my quarters and thought about Miss Richards' collection of expensive couches and chairs upstairs that I was going to have to keep immaculate. However, all this was typical in our new neighborhood. In short, there was nothing in that house to indicate that we were anything other than a wealthy young woman and her maid except our shared last name. Miss Richards felt that it was best for her to keep my family's name. I'm not sure why, but I think she felt more of a connection with my own family than her own. I in turn was told to assume the last name of her birth. It was a name that to Miss Richards carried with it a long tradition of subjugated women that I belonged with. I could not argue with her about that, and I willingly accepted it as part of my submission to Miss Richards. Shortly after we moved into our new home, Miss Richards took to hiring staff. She decided that she was going to hire 2 other maids and a cook. She sought an experienced maid to run the domestic staff, and Miss Charlotte responded. Miss Charlotte was in her early 40s and had been working as a domestic since she was 18 for another family until its patriarch died shortly before we moved into the neighborhood. The family then uprooted itself and moved to France, leaving their long-serving domestics without a job. I listened through the wall as Miss Richards talked to Miss Charlotte about her experience and asked if she would like to be the head domestic. Miss Charlotte was more than receptive. She embraced the idea and replied that she had achieved such a role at her previous employer. She told Miss Richards about her complex system of merits and demerits. My wife listened closely. I could tell by her unusual silence that she was intrigued. Miss Charlotte explained that the better a girl performs, the better their assignments should be. She listed serving Miss Richards and her guests at the top of the hierarchy of a maid's roles and listed cleaning up the maid's quarters at the low end. Miss Charlotte stressed that her system would help Miss Richards' home be maintained as optimally as possible. Good performance would result in merits that would result in better assignments, and vice versa. Miss Richards replied that she was receptive to the system and felt it was fair, but that she reserved the right to overrule it. Miss Charlotte was of course unwilling to disagree with her potential employer. My heart started to race as I became excited about the system I was going to work within with other domestics. Miss Charlotte would judge the quality of our work to decide if either I or the other junior maid got a particular assignment. I heard Miss Charlotte further explain that we risked demerits if we left dirt where we cleaned, took too long to do a task or stayed too long on break. We even could demerits based on our appearance. I felt an intense arousal as I listened as Miss Charlotte lay out how she would judge my work and by extension me. I would lose points if my hair was not neatly done. I would get demerits for wearing too much or too little makeup. My uniforms had to be kept neat and tidy, and I was expected to never eat or drink within the view of Miss Richards or her guests. Miss Charlotte was hired shortly after she finished describing the system that I would be toiling under. My wife then told her that she had already hired one junior maid named Annie. I smiled as I heard her give my female name and status to this stranger. Miss Charlotte asked about other employees. My wife said she was looking for another junior maid and a cook. Miss Charlotte immediately replied, "Miss Richards, may I make a suggestion?" "Certainly." Miss Charlotte replied, "There are 2 girls available from my old job that I believe would be perfect for you. There's the cook, Dana, and a maid I worked with named Tara." Miss Richards responded, "I'd be happy to give them an interview. Send for them, I'm sure I'll approve them based on your recommendation." "Thank you, Miss Richards. I'll call them at once." Within an hour, those 2 girls were standing before Miss Richards. I heard Miss Charlotte let them in from my sequestered location, and I heard my wife interview them. It seemed like a formality to me. My wife was impressed by Miss Charlotte and gave little effort to press the recommended domestics for any disqualifying information. With my coworkers hired, Miss Richards called out my name. I left my room and walked into the study where Miss Richards was seated among her domestics. I walked hesitantly towards the first people who were to see me in a dress besides my wife. I felt that I could pass myself off as a woman. I thought that I looked effeminate enough. I was no looker, but I felt that I looked womanish. While I was not terribly attractive, I was not clearly a man in pantyhose. I felt that I looked like a nerdish female version of my masculine self. I had been careful to create my new look to be as feminine as possible without veering into a ridiculously overly made-up look that I saw some cross-dressers go for. It took me years of practice, but I figured out the right amount of foundation, lipstick, eyeliner, and mascara to look presentable and not gaudy. After we moved to our new home, I made an electrolysis appointment. I went with Miss Richards, who helped decide upon the narrow arched shape my eyebrows took, to the beautician's amusement. That woman was a bit surprised at first that a man was having his eyebrows thinned into feminine arches and having all his body hair removed, but a customer was a customer for her. She was good about the whole thing, especially after Miss Richards gave her a large tip before she even started in exchange for not pestering us with questions. After my body hair was taken care of, I was taken for extensions at the most expensive salon in town. The stylist was surprised with what she had to work with, but again Miss Richards bought the girl's silence. I watched as the strands were added to my hair, giving me shoulder-length hair for the first time in my life. I felt deliciously femme before I was taken to get my hair dyed to a uniform color. I was shocked to find out that my blonde locks were dyed black at Miss Richards's behest. As we left the salon, Miss Richards explained that I was in charge of making sure my roots were always dyed to match the color she selected for me. I asked her then about the color change. She told me that it was done to help separate my self-perception as a maid from the man I had been all my life except in my head. I understood her reasoning and accepted it. Miss Richards also got my ears pierced shortly after we moved here. My earrings were plain silver and inexpensive. They contrasted nicely with the diamond ones that my loving mistress was fond of wearing. She also bought me several uniforms. They were all plain gray or black maid's dresses with detachable white aprons. I got a few pairs of low-heeled, black shoes for work as well as a few pairs of nude and black sheer pantyhose. The whole uniformed look was something that enticed me to the role I was now living since childhood, and I was about to show it to strangers for the first time. I walked into Miss Richards' study wearing my plain black dress with a white collar. My white apron covered part of the front of the dress as my nude pantyhose encased my legs and were in turn covered by the black, 1-inch heeled shoes on my feet. The domestics looked up at me as I entered. The looks were more passing than scrutinizing. None of them gave me an inquisitive look. I realized that I had passed as just another maid. I was not worthy of any more attention than any other girl they had seen in the position. I was ecstatic. I looked over the women for the first time and was instantly impressed by Miss Charlotte. She looked every bit the way I felt that a maid of her experience should. She was a dowdy woman. She stood barely more than 5 foot even and was on the heavy side. Her plump round face had little makeup upon it, as Miss Charlotte was well aware that she was not supposed to draw attention to herself. She knew it was not her place. Dana was a younger woman, in her early 30s. She was not going to live among us the way that Miss Charlotte and Tara were. She had her own living arrangements 2 towns over in a working-class neighborhood with her husband. She seemed genuinely relieved to have a job. Her face was prematurely aged, and she looked as if stress had taken its toll on her. However, she also seemed to try to embrace her relative youth. She stood in that room dressed in pants and a blouse that would not have seemed out of the ordinary on a woman in her 20s. She seemed to be trying to hold on to the youth that was slipping away from her, even as she probably realized that she was looking increasingly ridiculous doing so. Tara was the youngest of us. She was in her mid-20s with blonde hair tied back in a ponytail. She went light on the cosmetics, which she hardly needed with her perfect skin tone and radiant eyes. I wondered what she was doing working as a domestic. I figured a girl like her could get a decent husband and work in a less strenuous line of employment. My wife introduced me to the 3 women. They each said hello politely. I greeted them and said hello to Miss Charlotte last. I called her by her first name. Miss Charlotte paused and said, "Annie, I'm your supervisor. You will have to call me Miss Charlotte like the other girls do, unless Miss Richards objects." I turned to my wife, who smiled at me and said, "I have no objection to that." I blushed and said, "I'm sorry, Miss Charlotte. I'll be sure to give you the respect you deserve." My wife smirked at my deferential response to a maid before my wife told the 3 women when to report the next morning. With the introductions over with, I showed the women to the door as Tara and Miss Charlotte left to get ready to move into their new home. I turned and smiled at Miss Richards as they left, knowing that the last bits of our new lives had fallen into place. Miss Richards and I were now set in our roles. The next morning, I woke early and got to making Miss Richards her breakfast while the other staff arrived at our door. Miss Charlotte came first and relieved me of my duties in the kitchen as she handed me a copy of the rules that I would be expected to follow. I read through the demerits and merits that she had laid out to my wife the day before. I felt an intense feeling of arousal as I saw the rules that would determine the quality of my assignments. I smiled as I thought about how I was really under the foot of a domestic. I had grown up served by them, and now, a maid was my superior. I could not help but be aroused by the complete turnabout in my life. I finally had achieved what I wanted in life. I was no longer Master Thomas or Mr. Richards in the eyes of the household domestic. I was simply a domestic just like them. When I read through Miss Charlotte's rules, I figured that I would easily rack up merits. However, I quickly found the demerit system loomed large over me. Despite my natural submissiveness, there were occasional slip-ups in my conduct towards Miss Richards. A couple of times, I slipped and called her by her first name. Miss Richards would gently chide me to know my place. I think I kept doing it because I liked the feeling her sweetly condescending words caused to stir in me. She would smile and tell me to know my place. I enjoyed it so. That was until I made the mistake of calling my wife by her first name in front of Miss Charlotte. Miss Charlotte dropped the pen in her hand to the floor. The tapping sound it made on the floor drew my attention. Miss Charlotte gave me an enraged stare and said, "What did you just call Miss Richards, Annie?" I bowed my head and admitted, I called her Sophia, Miss Charlotte. Miss Charlotte shook her head at me disdainfully. I caught an amused look on Miss Richards's face at that moment. She was enjoying what she was seeing. I was about to be browbeat by a maid in the household that was titled in part to the name I had been born with and who was the man I had once pretended to be. Miss Charlotte stared me down and said, "That's 2 demerit points, Annie. You must never call your employer by her first name. You are not her equal, girl. She's is of blue blood, you're of a pink collar. She's is to be served, you're the server. Do you understand?" I nodded as I peered over to my wife, who apparently loved what she was seeing. Miss Charlotte caught my glance and shouted, "Never look at your mistress unless she speaks to you. Your eyes are not to meet hers unless she says that they may. You're a maid. I don't care what job you worked before Miss Richards found you, but that's what you are now. Learn your place, maid. Whatever delusions you have equality among women, lose them. You are not your mistress's equal, you're a tool to make her life easier and nothing more. Am I understood, maid?" I nodded to Miss Charlotte and answered, "Yes, perfectly clear. I'm sorry for what I've done. It won't happen again. See that it won't. Now, go finish your cleaning." "Yes, Miss Charlotte," I answered. I went back to cleaning, while Miss Richards gave me looks of lust and satisfaction. She got that way whenever Miss Charlotte scolded me. I got better with Miss Richards around my fellow domestics after that. I divorced myself from the notion that I was Miss Richards' husband and was ever the equal I masqueraded as around our friends and family. I was neither of those things. I knew that Miss Richards was a goddess that I had the good fortune of being blessed to worship. I was simply Annie, her lowly, loyal servant. That's just how the two of us liked it too. That was how everyone in the house knew us, and I intended to keep it that way. While I never made the mistake to call Miss Richards by her first name again, I was still frequently scolded by Miss Charlotte to Miss Richards' pleasure. I had started out believing that I would rack up merit points, but instead I found myself the only girl getting demerits. I was given demerits for my cleaning. Miss Charlotte would come around after I dusted and checked to see if any was left with a white glove. I failed that white glove test so many times that I figured that my score in the system would never get out of the negative numbers. It seemed that practically nothing I did was good enough for Miss Charlotte. My vacuuming took too long and my scrubbing left too much grimy residue. I left streaks on the windows. I missed wrinkles as I ironed. I wasn't even trusted to go shopping for supplies because of my failures. My demerits just kept piling up. Consequently, all the good assignments were split between Tara and Miss Charlotte. I was left with the most mundane tasks that did not require the perfection that others did. I was assigned to doing the laundry and cleaning Miss Richards' room. I only got the latter assignment because Miss Richards demanded that I alone do it. I know that Miss Charlotte was intrigued by that, but she never dared to ask Miss Richards why I was chosen for such an important task. I also got to clean the unused guest bedrooms and bathrooms. I would dust and vacuum those rooms for the benefit of no one. My wife seemed to enjoy that I was doing such pointless work. I would catch her staring up at me from her chair beside the pool as I cleaned the guest room windows on the back wall of the home. She would smirk up at me as I continued my labors in a maid's dress while she lounged around the pool in brightly colored, bikini bathing suits and wraps. My other assignments in the mansion's main areas involved cleaning the patios, terraces, and balconies daily. Since they were outdoor areas, Miss Charlotte was not as worried about keeping them perfectly clean because nature always seemed to be out to make a mess of them. Besides, Miss Charlotte did not want herself or Tara cast out into the elements when they had me around. Depending on the weather, I often shivered or sweated like a pig as I cleaned the outdoor furniture. It was my cleaning of the balcony that brought me my unwanted suitor. While I began to scrub the outdoor furniture, Tara was walking beneath the balcony and staring at one of the gardeners that Miss Richards had employed to landscape our gardens 2 days a week. She watched as he drew closer and stared up at the balcony. He caught sight of me, but my eyes never dared to leave the furniture I was ordered to clean. Tara watched him as he stared transfixed at me. She realized what he was looking at and approached him. The man spoke to her in his native tongue, believing that they were from the same geographical area, which provoked no reaction from her. He then spoke in English as best he could. Tara related to me later their conversation. The man identified himself as Jose. Tara identified herself and asked him who he was looking at. She told me later that Jose described me in sensual words. Miss Richards overheard her and asked her to repeat it again to her. Miss Richards reveled in the embarrassment that I showed at being found attractive by a man. Tara then laughed as she recounted to Miss Richards a night that she told him that I was her mistress's maid Capelia. She smirked and said that the reference went over his head. It also went over mine, but apparently not Miss Richards, who smiled. Miss Richards then smirked at me and said, "Can you go get this boy, Tara? I'm sure Annie would like a word with him." "Right away, Miss Richards," Tara replied dutifully. I looked at Miss Richards and said, "What are you doing? I don't want to deal with that guy." Miss Richards continued to smirk as she said, "Why do you suddenly think your opinion matters, Annie?" I hung my head as she picked up a book and took a seat by the door. Tara came in with Jose soon after. He was an older man with a receding hairline. She introduced us and Miss Richards, who gave nothing more than a stare to recognize his presence. Jose noticed that Miss Richards was in earshot and said, "I don't want to get you in trouble with your boss, but you were just so pretty, I have to ask." "I'm sorry, Jose. I can't talk. My mistress is watching." "Oh, don't be silly, Capelia. I'd never stand in the way of love," Miss Richards said as she looked up at me before she continued to pretend to be reading. Jose was emboldened and asked, "Would you like to go on a date sometime?" I looked over at Miss Richards. She gave me no visual clues as to what answer I should give. She just had a smirk plastered on her face. I squirmed and tried to let him down gently. "I'm not allowed to date, Jose," I finally said. "Oh, I see," he replied, looking at Miss Richards for confirmation before he turned and walked out the door. However, she simply ignored him this time and did not repeat her prior declaration. I was relieved that she apparently was prepared to stand in the way of his attraction. I knew she was simply trying to make me squirm. As Jose left, Tara gave me an odd look about why our mistress had let me flirt with the man. Miss Charlotte, Tara, and Dana were all unaware of my technical relation to Miss Richards. However, they knew I had a relationship with her that was unlike theirs. Miss Richards invited me to share her bedroom with her 1 to 4 nights a week. The maids heard our moans of pleasure on the rare nights when I was allowed to penetrate her. Most times, however, I was there for my oral services. The lack of reciprocity did not bother me. I knew that I existed for Miss Richards' pleasure and not the other way around. I only knew joy when she was satisfied. The worst thing that I could ever do was disappoint her. She was everything to me, and my own pleasure meant nothing to me. My relationship with Miss Richards was a sore spot between me and the other staff. Charlotte considered it a threat to her dominion over the other domestics. She made calculated decisions to make sure that I ran into Miss Richards as little as possible during our working hours. Miss Charlotte additionally warned me to stay away from Miss Richards. She had seen many domestics lose their position because of their consorting with their masters or mistresses. However, Miss Richards made complying with Miss Charlotte's admonition an impossibility. To Miss Charlotte's chagrin, I remained the only domestic permitted to clean Miss Richards' bedroom and bathroom. She could not understand what her employer saw in me or my skills, which were greatly inferior to both Miss Charlotte's and Tara's. I, however, knew the real reason that I alone was allowed in her room. Miss Richards had the entire house wired with cameras. She could watch the entire house on the closed-circuit televisions in her bedroom. She would often watch me toil throughout the mansion from the comfort of her own bed. I knew she took as great a pleasure from watching me keep her house clean and comply with the orders of a maid. I knew she was watching me, and I often went to extremes to make sure that I was clearly submissive to my senior maid. I was well aware that Miss Richards felt a surge of sexual pleasure whenever she witnessed me debasing myself. That was not lost on the other domestics either. While it was a burden with Miss Charlotte, it came to help me with the others. The apparent lesbian nature of my affair with Miss Richards was also disconcerting for Tara at first. We shared the same bedroom, and I know that Tara worried that I would make a move on her. That was until she watched Miss Richards and I interact. Once she saw Miss Richards scold me and order me about, she realized that I was not the initiator. She warmed up to me after that, but she still was careful to always look modest around me. Tara and the others became increasingly aware that I seemed to enjoy my status beneath Miss Richards and that she seemed to as well. Miss Richards came up with a special rule for me given my demerits. She called all the staff and said, "Girls, since Annie here can't seem to get out of her own way, I've decided that she needs special rules to set her aside from the other domestics." The girls all nodded in an agreement as if their opinions mattered. Miss Richards continued, "Annie, you're to now curtsy every time you see me, as well as my guests unless instructed otherwise." Miss Charlotte chimed in, "That's a wonderful idea, Miss Richards. This girl needs to understand her place." I gave Miss Charlotte a peeved look. I knew that she wanted to fire me, but she knew I was untouchable because of my relationship with Miss Richards. Miss Richards smiled and replied, "Thank you, Charlotte. In fact, you two are above Annie. Annie, you're to curtsy for her as well." Miss Charlotte beamed as her proper place in the domestics' hierarchy was affirmed by her employer. I hardly saw why she worried about it. I had all the worst assignments because of her with the exception of Miss Richards' bedroom and master bathroom. I was of absolutely no threat to her either. Miss Charlotte made sure that I always knew I was beneath her and even Tara too. Since I had the most demerits, Miss Charlotte ordered me to keep the servants' quarters clean. I would often laugh to myself when I thought of the wealth I had been born into as I made another maid's bed. I would think to myself that I had spent years at all the best schools the country had to offer merely to scrub a pink toilet that was only used by domestics. I would spend my nights without Miss Richards thinking about our different stations in life. We were both born into wealth and privilege, but only she enjoyed those gifts from our ancestors now. We were both trust fund babies, but I was now no more privileged than the junior maid whose bed I made daily. Miss Richards was pampered as I scrubbed. She ate expensive meals in the dining room on a hand-carved wood table while I was not even permitted to serve her there. That assignment belonged to Miss Charlotte and Tara. I grinned at the fact that I was not considered good enough to serve Miss Richards her meals after eating so many beside her. I would get excited as I thought about it, but I knew I could not masturbate because I was sharing the room with a fellow maid who thought a literal clit was between my legs. That only served as a further reminder of our different positions. Miss Richards was entitled to privacy, while I never had a moment alone that did not come in a bathroom. While she most often slept alone on a king-size bed with satin sheets, I shared a room with a maid who slept on a single bed that was identical to mine. Despite the sexual frustration I felt those nights, I felt that I was where I belonged. While my interactions were limited to Miss Richards and the domestic staff that to a woman considered me beneath them, Miss Richards was out making friends. Miss Richards was very active on the philanthropic scene, which brought her many new friends among the upper crust. They were over quite frequently. Tara and Miss Charlotte most frequently served them as Miss Charlotte did not trust me to do it. However, Miss Richards always went out of her way to make sure that I got an opportunity to curtsy to her guests and serve them all drinks and food. Watching me curtsy to these men and women brought a smile to Miss Richards' face, so I was happy to do it. Her friends all knew I was there, but I was just the help, so no one looked at me for very long. I didn't dare look at them either. I knew that if I made the mistake of making eye contact, Miss Charlotte would chew me out. A maid has no right to look one of her mistress's guests in the eyes. I knew that as a maid I was not on their level. I was inferior to them and had to behave as such. They were the lords and ladies of their manors and master and mistresses of their world. Conversely, I was nothing more than a maid there to serve them. They wore the crowns in life while I was there to carry the rags to clean them. I think that Miss Richards' favorite thing was watching me serve her friends. She would see me act just like any other domestic and be treated as such by her friends, who were all blissfully unaware that the junior maid before them was actually married to their regal hostess. Nothing about it ever bothered me until one dinner party. The 6 richest people from the neighborhood were in that room, for were among the guests that I served to the anger of Miss Charlotte. I was technically the richest person in that room, but that's all it was. In effect, it was all my wife's wealth, and she treated it that way, as did I. There were 3 couples in the room as well as Mr. Ferry. Mr. Ferry was a recent divorcee who traded in his trophy wives whenever they turned 30. He was the domineering sort that never sought an equal in a woman. He wanted a decoration to walk behind him and obey his every command. Women were frequently drawn to him as he was the embodiment of many female desires. He was a fantastically successful businessman who made his own fortune, unlike everyone else in my mistress's dining room that night. He was tall with movie star good looks and a lean, muscular body that even I realized was attractive. My Miss Richards was over 30 and was seemingly born to be disobedient to men, but that did not seem to stop Mr. Ferry from flirting with her. She smiled at him and brushed his arm lightly in a manner that alarmed me. For the first time, I realized what my change of status really meant. As a maid, I could not object to Miss Richards taking lovers or getting a boyfriend. My heart sunk as I realized that I was a silly maid for thinking I could keep her all to myself. Then something happened. Miss Richards looked at me and stopped, leaving the usually domineering man begging for her attention and affection like the dog he was. Despite what she did, I was worried about the implications of our arrangement as her guests left. After I finished helping Tara and Miss Charlotte clean up, I snuck off and hurried towards Miss Richards' bedroom with my shoes in my hand. I tried to be as quiet as I could because I did not want Miss Charlotte to know that I was going to bother our mistress while she was unwinding from a dinner party. I knocked on the door of Miss Richards' bedroom softly, but I heard no reply. I slowly opened the door and closed it behind me gently. I walked towards the closed master bathroom door and paused. I collected myself as I prepared myself for the worst news as I knocked upon the door of Miss Richards' master bathroom. I heard her splash her hands in the water and say, "Who is it, now?" I cleared my throat and said, "It's me, Miss Richards." "Annie. If you're busy, I'll come back later. Actually, I'll ask you tomorrow." "Nonsense. You've already bothered me, Annie. Come in and tell me now. I turned the doorknob and entered the bathroom, careful to close the door quietly behind me, still fearful of giving my location away to Miss Charlotte. Miss Richards was lounging in her porcelain tub. Her eyes peered up at me as I could see every sculpted inch of the perfect body I worshipped and worked at the foot of. She broke the silence that I had let go on too long and said, "Well, what do you have to say, Annie?" I swallowed a few times before I could get the nerve to say, "Miss Richards, I saw you flirt with Mr. Ferry at dinner." Miss Richards gave me a queer look and said, "And your point is, Annie? I would like to know if you're planning on seeing him." "Well, he's in my social circle, so I'm sure I'll be seeing him again." "I don't see how that's any of your business, however, maid," she replied with a smile. "I'm afraid you've misunderstood." "I've misunderstood," Miss Richards responded loudly. Her eyes glared at me, showing the familiar enjoyment of her dominance over me. I retreated a little and hastily said, "I'm sorry, Miss Richards, I haven't been clear enough. I wanted to know if you will be seeing Mr. Ferry, romantically." Miss Richards smiled at me and said, "Annie, are you afraid that you're losing your place with me?" I nodded slowly and put down my head. I peered up to see Miss Richards as she shook her head. She smiled and said, "I don't like such men, Annie. You know that well enough. They think only about themselves. They don't worry about pleasing me. You do. Years ago, I had other suitors, Annie, but I picked you. If I wanted a silly man, I would have gone for one of those boys that thought they could keep me under control. I choose you because you knew better. You know I have no use for men like Mr. Ferry." "I know, Miss Richards, but sometimes I get a little concerned and fear you might need a man." Miss Richards laughed and replied, "I don't need a man, Annie. I've got you."